20,000 feet above the freezing North Sea, physics stopped making sense. It was the 31st of December 1944, and Captain Glenn Rojon found himself trapped in a nightmare that aviation engineers would have sworn was impossible. Two massive B-17 flying fortresses, each weighing over 60,000 pounds, had violently collided in midair. But instead of spiraling into a fiery oblivion, the bombers locked together, metal tearing into metal, fusing into a monstrous 8-engine behemoth. With engines dying, structural integrity failing, and an incapacitated crew in the bomber pinned beneath them, Rojon faced a terrifying choice. This is the unbelievable true story of the piggyback flight. Morning in the English countryside on the 31st of December 1944 was not merely cold. It was a damp, bone-chilling entity that seemed to seep through wool, leather, and skin. At RAF Thorpe Abbotts, the muddy home of the 8th Air Force's 100th Bombardment Group, the heavy fog clung to the tarmac like a gray shroud. In the pre-dawn darkness, the briefing room was a cramped sanctuary of stale cigarette smoke, nervous sweat, and the sharp scent of wet wool. Captain Glenn Rojon, a steady, square-jawed farm boy from Pennsylvania, sat near the front of the room. At 22 years old, Rojon possessed the quiet, unflappable demeanor required to survive the meat grinder of the European air war. Beside him sat his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant William G. Leake, Jr., a man whose sharp reflexes and calm voice over the interphone had gotten them through numerous scrapes. They were part of the Bloody 100th, a bomber group that had earned its grim moniker through staggering losses over places like Munster and Regensburg. Neither man needed to be told that any mission launched in this soupy weather was going to be difficult, but when the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain to reveal the target map, a collective groan echoed through the corrugated Nissen hut. A thick red ribbon stretched from the English coast, across the North Sea, and deep into the heavily fortified heart of Germany, terminating in a terrifyingly familiar location, Hamburg. The target was a massive synthetic oil refinery, a critical artery of the Nazi war machine. It was also one of the most heavily defended cities in the Third Reich. There would be no popping champagne corks for New Year's Eve. There would only be the freezing altitude, the brutal gauntlet of German anti-aircraft fire, and the relentless swarm of the Luftwaffe. As the briefing concluded, the crews piled into the back of canvas-covered transport trucks. The ride to the hardstands was silent. Men checked and rechecked their gear, heavy sheepskin flying suits, electrically heated blue boots that often shorted out, throat microphones, and the cumbersome yellow Mae West life preservers. Above all, they checked their oxygen masks. At 20,000 feet, the temperature could plummet to 60 degrees below zero, and the air was too thin to sustain consciousness. A frozen oxygen line meant a quiet, unnoticed death long before the enemy could fire a shot. Out on the dispersal pads, the B-17G flying fortresses loomed in the fog like sleeping leviathans. Rojon approached his aircraft, running a gloved hand along the cold, damp aluminum skin. Ground crews had been up all night fueling the tanks and loading thousands of pounds of high explosives into the bomb bays. The four Wright R-182097 Cyclone radial engines dripped with oil and condensation. "All right, let's get her warmed up," Rojon called out to Leake. They climbed through the belly hatch, moving past the bombardier's station, and up into the cramped, instrument-lined cockpit. The pre-flight checklist was a practiced ballet of flipped switches, adjusted mixtures, and primed magnetos. One by one, the four massive engines coughed, belched plumes of blue-white smoke, and roared to life. The entire airframe vibrated with immense, barely contained power. Taking off in dense fog with a fully loaded bomber was an act of blind faith. Rojon eased the throttles forward, feeling the 65,000-pound aircraft lumber down the runway. He kept his eyes locked on the faint glow of the runway lights, his feet dancing on the rudder pedals to keep the nose straight. At operational speed, he hauled back on the heavy control yoke. The rumbling wheels left the earth, and they were instantly swallowed by the impenetrable gray mist. Climbing through the overcast, the tension in the cockpit was suffocating. Hundreds of other bombers were doing the exact same thing, in the exact same airspace, completely blind. The radio was strictly silent. A single stray transmission could give away their position or drown out a critical abort order. They climbed for what felt like hours, the engines straining, the turbo superchargers whining as they fought for thinner, colder air. At 12,000 feet, they broke through the cloud deck into blinding, brilliant sunshine. Below them lay an endless ocean of pure white clouds. All around them, like a miraculous conjuring trick, hundreds of other silver B-17s were bursting through the cloud layer, banking and turning to find their respective squadrons. Rojan spotted the flare ship and nudged the yoke, bringing his fortress into its assigned slot within the staggered three-dimensional V formation. The combat box was a marvel of defensive engineering, designed to ensure that no matter where an enemy fighter approached from, it would be met by a devastating crossfire of dozens of 50-caliber machine guns. But the formation also required intense, exhausting concentration to maintain. Aircraft flew mere feet apart. One sloppy turn by a tired pilot could result in a catastrophic mid-air collision. As they leveled off at 20,000 feet, the deep freeze set in. Frost instantly bloomed on the plexiglass windows. Rojan and Leek exchanged a glance through their bulky oxygen masks. Down below, somewhere in a different squadron of the vast armada, First Lieutenant William McNabb and his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Nelson Vaughn, were wrestling their own B-17 into position. The armada of heavy bombers formed a massive, droning river of aluminum in the sky, turning their noses eastward toward the North Sea, toward the continent, and toward the waiting guns of Hamburg. The English Channel and the North Sea passed silently beneath the dense cloud cover. The bombers pushed deeper into hostile territory, a slow, inexorable march at 160 miles per hour. As they crossed the enemy coastline, the relative safety of the sea evaporated. Navigator to pilot, "We are crossing the enemy coast," came the crackling voice over the interphone. "Roger," Rojan replied, his grip tightening on the yoke. "Gunners, keep your eyes peeled. Call out anything that moves." The first sign of trouble was the absence of friendly escorts. Heavy fog over the fighter bases in England and France had grounded the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that were supposed to shepherd the bomber stream to the target. The little friends were nowhere to be seen. The 8th Air Force bombers were entirely naked, flying into the teeth of the German air defense network with no top cover. It was a scenario that invited a slaughter. An hour later, the horizon ahead grew dark, but not from storm clouds. The sky over the approach to Hamburg was stained with ugly, greasy black smudges. Flak. "Here comes the barrage," Leek muttered, adjusting his flak helmet. The German anti-aircraft batteries around Hamburg were legendary for their accuracy and density. They used massive 88mm and 128mm radar-directed cannons that could hurl a lethal, explosive shell miles into the sky. As Rojan's squadron entered the flak zone, the serene drone of the engines was violently interrupted by the terrifying concussions of exploding artillery. Wham! Crump! The sky around them erupted in terrifying blossoms of black smoke and red fire. The explosions were so close that the concussion waves physically lifted the massive B-17, tossing it around like a toy boat in a turbulent bathtub. The sound of shrapnel tearing through the aluminum skin of the bomber was a horrifying, ripping noise, like a giant throwing handfuls of gravel against a tin roof. "Hold her steady, Mac. We're on the IP," Rojan instructed over the interphone, referring to the initial point of the bomb run. From here on, evasive action was forbidden. The aircraft had to fly straight and level, so the bombardier could synchronize the Norden bomb sight. For the next 5 agonizing minutes, they were sitting ducks. To their left, a B-17 took a direct hit to its number 3 engine. The wing sheared off cleanly, folding backward in a blinding flash of aviation fuel. The crippled bomber spun violently out of formation, trailing a massive banner of fire. Parachutes, impossibly small and frail, began to blossom in its wake as the crew bailed out into the sub-zero sky. Rojan forced himself not to look. His only job was to keep his wings level. "Bombs away," the bombardier finally called out. The B-17 shuddered and leaped upward, instantly relieved of thousands of pounds of ordnance. "Bomb bay doors closing. Let's get the hell out of here," Leek said, banking the aircraft slightly as the formation leader initiated the turn off the target. But escaping the flak merely meant entering a new kind of hell. As the bombers exited the anti-aircraft zone, the flak suddenly and ominously ceased. Veteran flyers knew exactly what that eerie quiet meant. The German gunners below had stopped firing because their own fighters were entering the fray. "Bandits! 12 o'clock high! Coming out of the sun!" the top turret gunner screamed over the interphone. Rojan squinted through the frost-rimmed windshield. Tiny black dots were plunging out of the blinding glare of the high-altitude sun. Within seconds, the dots materialized into the blunt noses and swept wings of Focke-Wulf Bf-190S and Messerschmitt Bf-109S. The Luftwaffe fighters were employing their most lethal tactic, the head-on pass. Closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour, the German pilots aggressively pushed their throttles forward, their wings sparkling with the terrifying strobes of 20mm cannon fire. The B-17s' own 50 caliber machine guns erupted in response. The entire airframe vibrated violently under the recoil. The smell of burnt cordite immediately filled the cockpit, sharp and acrid. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the sky in a deadly, beautiful geometry of red and green lines. A Focke-Wulf screamed past Rojan's cockpit window, so close he could clearly see the black crosses on its wings and the dark helmet of the pilot inside. Immediately behind the fighter, another B-17 inches, the formation absorbed a burst of cannon fire. Its cockpit shattered in a spray of glass and blood, and the huge bomber slowly pitched its nose up, stalled, and then fell away into a death dive. The combat box was bleeding. The relentless waves of German fighters were tearing holes in the defensive formation. The overlapping fields of fire were breaking down. "We've got a gap below, and to our right," Leek called out, scanning the chaos outside his window. A bomber had just been blown out of the sky, leaving a vulnerable hole in the lower element of their squadron's V formation. "I see it. I'm sliding down to fill it," Rojan replied. Leaving a gap meant inviting a German fighter to fly right into the heart of the formation and tear them apart from the inside. Rojan gripped the heavy yoke, pushing his boots against the rudder pedals, fighting the immense physical resistance of the non-hydraulically boosted controls. He eased their bomber, the little skipper, down and across the freezing sky, aiming for the empty airspace directly above the lowest aircraft in the formation. That lowest aircraft was piloted by Lieutenant William McNabb, with Nelson Vaughn in the right seat. McNabb's plane had already taken a severe beating from the flak and the fighters. As Rojan settled his massive bomber into the protective slot just above them, he kept a nervous eye on his instruments. The air was turbulent, churned into violent prop wash by hundreds of engines and the chaotic wakes of diving fighters. Above the roar of his own engines, Rojan heard the distinct, terrifying staccato thump of a 20mm cannon impacting metal somewhere below. He didn't know it yet, but the precarious balance of the battle was about to tip from standard wartime horror into unprecedented, physics-defying madness. At 20,000 feet, survival depends on predictability. The pilots in a combat box flew in a state of hyper-vigilant exhaustion, trusting that the man beside, above, and below them would maintain a steady course. Rojan held his yoke with a white-knuckled grip, his eyes constantly darting between his flight instruments and the bomber ahead of him. He was positioned perfectly in the slot, providing overhead fire support for the bomber directly below him. Suddenly, a massive shadow eclipsed the sun, filtering through the bottom of Rojan's peripheral vision. There was no warning on the radio. There was no slow drift. Lieutenant William McNabb's B-17 surged violently upward. Whether McNabb and his co-pilot, Nelson Vaughn, had been instantly killed or severely incapacitated by a sudden burst of cannon fire through their cockpit, or whether a massive, violent updraft had caught their battered wings, no one would ever know. The 60,000-pound machine abandoned its flight path and hurled itself upward like a breaching whale. Rojan had less than a fraction of a second to react. His brain barely registered the incoming expanse of olive-drab metal before the world ended in a deafening, catastrophic explosion of sound. Crash. The impact was unimaginably violent. It wasn't a glancing blow. It was a dead center, belly-to-back collision. The screeching sound of tearing duralumin and snapping steel cables drowned out the roar of the engines. Rojan's entire bomber was thrown upward, the control yoke violently ripping itself from his grip and slamming against his chest. Leek was thrown hard against his shoulder harness, his helmet bouncing off the side window. Sparks showered through the cockpit. The smell of raw, high-octane aviation fuel instantly flooded the air, a terrifying omen of an imminent fireball. Below them, the top turret of McNabb's bomber, a heavy dome of reinforced steel and twin, 50 caliber machine guns smashed directly through the thin aluminum belly of Rojan's plane, punching through the floorboards just behind the cockpit. Simultaneously, the heavy steel framework of Rojan's ball turret, hanging from the bottom of his plane, crashed through the roof of McNabb's fuselage. Instead of bouncing off each other and shattering their respective wings, the two aircraft locked. The jammed turrets acted like massive, twisted coupling pins. The metal fused. The propellers of McNabb's upward-surging engines bit violently into the underside of Rojan's wings, chewing through aluminum skin and sparking against the engine nacelles before grinding themselves to a halt. In Rojan's cockpit, sheer pandemonium reigned. "What the hell was that?" Leek shouted, desperately grabbing his yoke and pulling back. "We've been hit! We've been rammed!" Rojan yelled back, fighting to regain control. The controls were impossibly heavy, behaving like they were set in wet concrete. Rojan pushed his feet against the rudder pedals with all his strength, but they barely moved. The entire aircraft was shuddering violently, groaning under a stress it was never engineered to withstand. The nose of their B-17 pitched down sickeningly. Rojan looked out his side window to check the damage to his left wing. His breath caught in his throat. There, mere inches below his own wing, was another wing. He could clearly see the spinning propellers of another bomber's engines, roaring away right underneath his own nacelles. He leaned forward, craning his neck. He could see the entire front half of McNabb's fuselage wedged tightly against the bottom of his own aircraft. "Bill," Rojan said over the interphone, his voice eerily calm despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "Look out your window." Leek looked down. His eyes widened in absolute horror. "My God, Glenn, he's stuck to us. We're riding him." It was an impossible sight. Two B-17s, designed to fly as agile, independent fortresses, had been transformed into a single, dragging, 8-engine freak of aerodynamics. They were flying piggyback, pilot to crew, sound off. "Is everyone alive back there?" Rojan yelled into his throat mic. "Tail gunner here, I'm okay," came a shaky voice. "Waist gunner's okay. Captain, the floor is torn wide open. There's a whole other plane sticking through the bottom of the..." Rojan's mind raced. Standard operating procedure dictated bailing out immediately after a mid-air collision. The structural integrity of the aircraft was completely compromised. With engines grinding against each other and fuel lines likely severed, they were a flying powder keg. Any second, a spark could ignite the fuel vapor, blowing both crews to atoms. "Cut the engines," Rojan ordered. If the propellers kept grinding, they would start a fire, or worse, completely sever Rojan's wings from the fuselage. Leek scrambled to pull the mixture controls, cutting the fuel to their 4 right cyclones. Their engines coughed and died, the propellers feathering into the wind. But the monstrous conjoined aircraft didn't fall. The roar of engines continued. "I cut them, Glenn, but we've still got power," Leek shouted over the noise. Rojan realized with a sinking horror what was happening. McNabb's engines were still running at full throttle. The bomber pinned underneath them was essentially carrying them, its engines screaming under the impossible load of an extra 60,000 pounds of dead weight strapped to its back. "His engines are still wide open," Rojan said, fighting the stiff control yoke. The conjoined monstrosity began a slow, agonizing, wide circle to the left. The aerodynamics were a disaster. The drag was immense, and they were steadily losing altitude. "Can you reach them on the radio?" Rojan asked. "Tell them to throttle back. Tell them we need to coordinate the controls." Leek switched to the squadron frequency, then to the emergency channel. "Aircraft below us. This is the ship on your roof. Cut your power. I repeat, cut your power. You're dragging us into a spin." Only static hissed back in their headsets. "Try again," Rojan grunted, his arms shaking, as he and Leek both planted their boots on the right rudder pedal, trying to counteract the massive leftward pull of the conjoined airframes. Nothing, Glenn. I'm getting nothing. Leek looked over at his captain, the grim reality settling over the frozen cockpit. The pilots in the bomber below were either dead, unconscious, or trapped in a shattered cockpit, unable to reach their throttles. Their engines were locked at full combat power, dragging both planes down toward the freezing waters of the North Sea. They were entirely at the mercy of a runaway, pilotless bomber strapped to their belly. Around them, the air battle continued to rage, but to Rojan and Leek, the rest of the war had suddenly ceased to exist. They were trapped in a horrifying embrace. Two mating dragonflies, made of torn metal and high explosives, slowly descending into the abyss. The altimeter needle was unwinding with terrifying speed. 19,000 feet. 18,000. The two conjoined B-17s, a tangled mass of 120,000 pounds of torn aluminum and highly flammable aviation fuel, were caught in a morbid downward spiral. Captain Glenn Rojan and Lieutenant William Leek sat in the cockpit of the upper aircraft. Their boots braced furiously against the right rudder pedal. They were fighting a losing battle against the aerodynamic drag of the dead behemoth pinned beneath them. The lower bomber, piloted by the unresponsive Lieutenant William McNabb, had its throttles jammed wide open. The roar of those four runaway Wright Cyclone engines vibrated through the floorboards, shaking Rojan's teeth in his skull. "I can't hold her much longer, Glenn." Leek shouted over the deafening mechanical shriek of metal grinding against metal. His face was pale, sweat freezing on his forehead beneath his leather flying helmet. The control yoke was trying to violently rip itself from his grip, pulling hard to the left. "Keep your foot on that pedal. Push." Rojan barked back, his own muscles burning from the immense physical exertion. There were no hydraulic assists in a B-17. It was entirely manual pulleys, cables, and raw human strength. Right now, it required the combined strength of two desperate men just to keep the monstrous 8-engine hybrid from flipping onto its back and dropping like a stone. Behind them, the fuselage was a scene of unparalleled carnage. The top turret of McNabb's bomber was wedged firmly into the belly of Rojan's aircraft, tearing through the radio room and severing vital control cables. Cold air screamed through the jagged gashes in the floor. Rojan knew the brutal mathematics of their situation. The lower plane was pulling them down and to the left. If they let go of the controls for even a second to attempt an escape, the massive drag of the lower aircraft's left wing would instantly snap them into a violent, unrecoverable death spin. Centrifugal force would pin them to the bulkhead, making it impossible to reach the bailout hatches. But if they stayed, they were riding a flying bomb all the way to the ground. He had to get his crew out first. Rojan keyed his throat microphone. "Pilot to crew. Bail out. Bail out. Abandon ship." The interphone was a chaotic mess of static, wind noise, and panic breathing. Rojan needed to ensure every man knew the protocol. Even as the plane shuddered violently around them, in the terrifying confusion of a mid-air collision, discipline was the only thing standing between survival and a chaotic, tangled death. Standard bailout sequence for a crippled B-17, asterisk navigator and bombardier. Exit through the forward nose hatch. Clear the spinning propellers before pulling the ripcord. Asterisk flight engineer, top turret gunner. Drop down from the turret platform and follow the nose crew out the forward hatch, or use the bomb bay if the nose is blocked. Asterisk radio operator. Exit through the bomb bay doors, taking extreme care not to snag the parachute harness on the tangled racks. Asterisk waist gunners and ball turret gunner. Exit through the side waist windows or the main aft door. Asterisk tail gunner. Roll out through the dedicated emergency escape hatch located beneath the tail guns. "Acknowledge," Rojan yelled. "Navigator, roger. We're blowing the nose hatch," came the shaky voice of Lieutenant Shirley. "Waist gunner, roger. Floor is gone back here, Captain, but we're getting out." "Tail gunner, roger. I'm popping the hatch." One by one, the men in the back unclipped from their oxygen consoles, knowing they only had minutes of consciousness at this altitude. They strapped on their heavy chest parachutes, fighting the violent lurching of the dying aircraft. In the waist section, Staff Sergeant Edward Newhouse stared in disbelief at the jagged metal of another B-17 intruding directly into his workspace. The wind howling through the torn floorboards was 50 degrees below zero. He grabbed his parachute, signaled to the other waist gunner, and threw himself out of the side window into the blinding, freezing slipstream of the high-altitude sky. Up front, Rojan and Leek watched the agonizingly slow procession of their crew bailing out. Through the gaps in the floor, they saw the bomb bay doors swing open. A few seconds later, 3 small, olive-drab figures tumbled out into the void, rapidly shrinking into dots before white silk canopies blossomed against the gray clouds far below. "That's the radio op and the gunners," Leek grunted, his arms trembling violently as he maintained his death grip on the yoke. "Are the nose boys out?" "Surely." "Are you out?" Rojan called over the interphone. There was no answer, just the hollow rush of wind. They had to assume the front compartment was empty. "Okay, Bill," Rojan said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the authoritative bark and taking on a grim, terrifying calmness. "It's just you and me. Let's get the hell out of here." "On 3, Leek shouted. The plan was simple but nearly impossible. They had to release the controls simultaneously, unbuckle their harnesses, scramble out of their seats, and dive through the forward hatch before the conjoined bombers snapped into a fatal spin. "1," Rojan yelled, his foot aching against the rudder. "2," Leek responded, gripping the buckle of his harness. 3. Both men released the control yoke. Instantly, all hell broke loose. Freed from the counteracting pressure of the pilots, the immense, unbalanced drag of the lower aircraft violently yanked the conjoined behemoth to the left. The nose dropped with sickening speed. A massive wall of negative G-force slammed into the cockpit, tossing Rojan and Leek upward against the cockpit roof. The aircraft wasn't just turning, it was snapping into an inverted dive. "Grab it! Grab it!" Rojan screamed, realizing his fatal miscalculation. They had grossly underestimated the aerodynamic torque. There was no time to reach the hatch. If they didn't regain control immediately, they would be pulverized against the ceiling of the cockpit as the plane ripped itself apart in the descent. Fighting the violent G-forces, both men clawed desperately at the empty air, lunging for the control columns. Leek's fingers brushed the cold plastic of the yoke. He hooked his hands over it and hauled back with every ounce of strength in his upper body. Rojan slammed into his seat, stomping his boots back onto the right rudder pedal. Groaning under the immense strain, the massive dual airframe sluggishly responded. The violent leftward roll slowed, then agonizingly stopped. The nose pulled up just enough to break the dive, settling back into a terrifying, dragging, flat descent. Rojan and Leek sat panting in their seats, their chests heaving, adrenaline flooding their veins like battery acid. The reality of their situation settled over them like a lead weight. They looked at each other across the cramped, freezing cockpit. The unspoken truth was deafening. They were not going to bail out. The moment they let go of the controls, the aircraft would flip and crush them. They were mechanically tethered to the beast. They were going to have to ride this burning, grinding monstrosity all the way to the ground, 14,000 feet. The cloud deck below them was approaching rapidly, a solid floor of gray, ominously waiting to swallow them. The physical toll of flying the conjoined bombers was becoming unbearable. Both Rojan and Leek had their right boots pressed firmly against the right rudder pedal, their legs trembling uncontrollably from the sustained exertion. Their arms were locked, pulling the yoke back, and to the right, to counteract the relentless pull of the runaway engines beneath them. "We're losing about 400 feet a minute," Leek announced, his eyes glued to the vertical speed indicator. "If this descent rate holds, we'll hit the deck in about half an hour. If we don't blow up first," Rojan grimly replied. The friction between the two aluminum airframes was generating immense heat. Every time they hit a pocket of turbulence, the metal groaned and shrieked, sparks showering from the belly of Rojan's plane. Worse still, the engines of McNabb's lower bomber were beginning to fail under the horrific strain. Below them, the number 3 engine of the trapped B-17 began to cough. Thick, black, oily smoke poured from the cowling, wrapping around Rojan's right wing. A few moments later, a bright orange tongue of flame licked out from the exhaust stack. "Fire on the lower right engine!" Leek yelled. The threat matrix. Immediate danger. The fire spreading to the fuel tanks in the lower wing, causing a catastrophic mid-air explosion. Secondary danger. the fire compromising the structural integrity of the wing spar, causing the lower wing to snap, which would instantly throw them into a fatal roll. Tertiary danger. Smoke inhalation in the cockpit if the ventilation system pulled the toxic fumes upward. Rojan watched the flames grow, his heart pounding against his ribs. There was absolutely nothing they could do. They couldn't reach the lower plane's fire extinguishers. They couldn't cut its fuel. They were entirely at the mercy of the burning engine. "Burn out, please. Just burn out," Rojan prayed silently. As if answering his silent plea, the overworked Wright Cyclone engine finally surrendered. With a violent shudder that shook both aircraft, the engine seized. The internal components melted and fused together, the massive propeller freezing in place with a sickening clunk. Deprived of fuel, the flames flickered and died, leaving behind only a trail of white, acrid smoke. But the death of the engine created a new aerodynamic nightmare. Now the lower plane had 2 running engines on its left wing, and only 1 running engine on its right. The asymmetrical thrust violently yanked the conjoined bombers even harder to the right, reversing the torque they had been fighting for the last 20 minutes. "Switch legs, left pedal, push left," Rojan screamed, his brain scrambling to adapt to the new physics of their dying machine. Both men frantically shifted their weight, stomping on the left rudder pedal to keep the nose from swinging wildly out of control. The physical whiplash was exhausting. Their muscles, already pushed to the point of failure, screamed in protest. They broke through the cloud layer at 5,000 feet. The sudden visibility offered no comfort. Below them was the cold, steel-gray expanse of the North Sea, giving way to the mudflats and green fields of the German coastline. They were miles behind enemy lines, descending toward the very soil they had come to bomb. "We're going to have to put her down, Glenn. There's no other way out of this," Leake said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I see a clearing up ahead," Rojan replied, squinting through the frost-streaked windshield. "Looks like a large field near that town. Wilhelmshaven, maybe." Crash landing, a perfectly healthy B-17, was a dangerous, often fatal maneuver. Crash landing, 2 of them, stacked on top of each other, with locked controls and live ordnance still aboard the lower aircraft, was tantamount to suicide. The landing gear of Rojan's plane was useless. It would just smash into the roof of McNabb's plane. The landing gear of McNabb's plane couldn't be deployed because the pilots were incapacitated. They were going to have to belly land the lower bomber, using it as a massive, explosive sled. "Cut all power to the battery. Turn off the magnetos. We don't want a spark when we hit," Rojan ordered. He reached up and switched off the master electrical switches. The cockpit fell eerily silent, save for the howling wind and the grinding roar of the lower plane's remaining engines, 1,000 feet. The details of the German countryside rushed up to meet them. Rojan could see trees, farmhouses, and snow-dusted fields. "Pull back, Bill. Don't let the nose drop. We have to hit flat," Rojan yelled. 500 feet, the massive 8-engine shadow of their conjoined bombers raced across the frozen fields below them. "Brace yourself." At 130 miles per hour, the belly of Lieutenant McNabb's battered B-17 struck the hard, frozen earth of northern Germany. The impact was cataclysmic, a deafening roar of crushing metal, shattering plexiglass, and tearing earth filled the air. The friction of 60,000 pounds of aluminum grinding across frozen dirt tore the belly of the lower bomber to shreds. Dirt, rocks, and debris violently sprayed up into Rojan's shattered floorboards. The sheer kinetic energy of the crash sent the conjoined monstrosity sliding across the field for hundreds of yards. The remaining engines of the lower plane violently dug into the dirt, cartwheeling the propellers and tearing the engines clean off their mounts. In the upper cockpit, Rojan and Leake were thrown forward with bone-crushing force, their shoulder harnesses locked, biting painfully into their collarbones as the instrument panel dissolved into a blur of vibration and flying glass. Slowly, agonizingly, the tortured metal screeched to a halt. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. No wind, no engines, just the terrifying, delicate hissing of high-octane fuel dripping onto hot metal. Rojan blinked, tasting blood in his mouth. He looked to his right. Lieutenant Leake was slumped in his seat, groaning, but alive. They had survived the piggyback flight. But as Rojan unbuckled his harness and looked out the shattered side window at the German soldiers sprinting toward them across the field, rifles raised, he realized that their war was far from over. Down in the mangled wreckage of the lower bomber, a grim discovery awaited, a testament to the ultimate, inescapable cost of the air war. The silence that followed the crash was heavier than the roar of the engines had been. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, broken only by the sharp ticks of cooling metal and the terrifying, steady hiss of ruptured fuel tanks bleeding high-octane gasoline into the frozen German soil. Captain Glenn Rojan hung suspended in his shoulder straps, his chest heaving as he stared through the spiderweb cracks of the shattered windshield. His hands, still molded to the shape of the control yoke, were locked in cramps so severe he had to pry his fingers open one by one. Beside him, Lieutenant William Leake let out a long, ragged exhale that frosted in the freezing air of the battered cockpit. "We're down," Leake whispered, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile reality of their survival. "Glenn, we're on the ground." "Don't unbuckle yet," Rojan commanded, his voice raspy. "If that fuel touches a hot manifold, this whole field goes up. Wait for the fire." They sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, counting the seconds. 10, 20, a minute. The wind whistled through the jagged holes in the fuselage, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and raw petroleum, but no smoke followed. The catastrophic fireball they both expected never materialized. The violent sliding had packed the engine nacelles with freezing mud, miraculously smothering the hot metal before it could ignite the vapors. "All right," Rojan finally breathed. "Let's get out of here. Fast." Navigating the cockpit was a nightmare. The floor behind their seats had been pushed upward by the immense pressure of the bomber beneath them, turning the flight deck into a mangled cage. They unbuckled their harnesses and squeezed through the shattered side windows, sliding down the icy olive-drab aluminum of the fuselage. When their boots hit the ground, Rojan's legs buckled. The sheer adrenaline that had sustained him for the last 30 minutes suddenly evaporated, leaving his muscles shaking uncontrollably. Leake caught his captain by the shoulder, helping him stand. For the first time, the two men turned around to look at the machine they had just flown. It was a monument to impossible physics. The two B-17 flying fortresses were grotesquely fused, sitting in a massive trench of churned earth. The wings of the top bomber, the little skipper, were bent upward at unnatural angles, while the fuselage of the bottom bomber, piloted by Lieutenant William McNabb, was completely flattened against the frozen mud, crushed under the immense weight of the upper aircraft. The tail section of the lower bomber was sheared entirely off, lying 50 yards back in the debris trail. "My God," Leake muttered, pulling his leather flying cap off and wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. "How did that thing fly? How did we not drop like a stone?" Rojan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the crushed forward section of the lower bomber. The cockpit where McNabb and his co-pilot, Nelson Vaughn, had been sitting was a compressed tomb of twisted aluminum and shattered glass. "We have to check on them," Rojan said, his voice dropping. They staggered across the frozen furrows, approaching the wreckage from the starboard side. The metal groaned, settling into the dirt. Rojan fell to his knees near the crushed nose of the bottom aircraft, peering through a jagged tear in the aluminum skin. It was immediately, devastatingly clear that no one in the front of the lower aircraft had survived the initial impact, let alone the crash landing. Whether McNabb and Vaughn had been killed instantly by the anti-aircraft fire over Hamburg, or whether they had been incapacitated and trapped when the two massive planes violently mated in the sky, it was a question that would never truly be answered. They had died at their posts, their lifeless bodies locked at the controls, their engines screaming at full throttle to carry Rojan and Leake miles away from the North Sea. Rojan closed his eyes, a profound, sickening wave of survivor's guilt washing over him. The air war was a lottery of inches and seconds. Why had McNabb's plane surged upward? Why hadn't the fuel ignited? Why were two farm boys from America standing alive in a German field, while two others were entombed in a mountain of metal? A sharp shout in German broke his reverie. "Hände hoch! Hände hoch!" Rojan and Leake spun around. Advancing across the snowy field were half a dozen soldiers in the field gray uniforms of the German Wehrmacht. They had their Mauser rifles raised, the cold steel bayonets fixed and pointed directly at the two American aviators. The soldiers approached cautiously, their eyes darting nervously between the two men and the colossal, smoking wreckage behind them. The German sergeant in the lead lowered his rifle slightly, his mouth open in sheer disbelief as he took in the sight of the two stacked bombers. He looked at Rojan, then at Leek, then back to the wreckage. "You," the sergeant stammered in broken, heavily accented English, pointing a gloved finger at the mountain of torn metal. "You fly this?" Rojan slowly raised his hands above his head, feeling the cold air bite into his raw, blistered palms. Beside him, Leek did the same. "Yeah," Rojan replied quietly, his voice devoid of any triumph. "We flew it." The sergeant shook his head, a look of profound, unfeigned respect crossing his hardened face before the mask of the enemy returned. He gestured sharply with the barrel of his rifle. "Kommen Sie. Für Sie ist der Krieg vorbei. For you, the war is over." The transition from the absolute freedom of the sky to the claustrophobic confines of a prisoner-of-war camp was a psychological shock that broke many men. For Captain Glenn Rojan and Lieutenant William Leek, the journey began in the back of a canvas-covered Opel Blitz truck, bouncing over the cratered roads of the collapsing Third Reich. They were initially taken to an interrogation center near Frankfurt. The Luftwaffe intelligence officers were notoriously thorough. They knew the names of the bomb group commanders, the tail numbers of the aircraft, and the tactics of the 8th Air Force. But when it came to Rojan and Leek, the interrogations took a bizarre turn. A senior Luftwaffe officer, an aristocratic man with a scarred cheek and impeccable English, laid a series of aerial reconnaissance photographs on the wooden table in front of Rojan. They were photos of the crash site. "Captain Rojan," the officer said, tapping the photograph with a silver pen, "my engineers have inspected this wreckage. They tell me that aerodynamically, a controlled descent was impossible. The center of gravity was destroyed. The drag coefficient was insurmountable. They believe the crew of the lower aircraft must have been flying it with you." "The crew of the lower aircraft were dead," Rojan said flatly, staring a hole through the officer. "My co-pilot and I flew it down." The German officer studied Rojan for a long time in silence. "If what you say is true, Captain, it is a pity you are an American. That is a feat of airmanship that belongs in the legends of the fatherland." They were soon packed into freezing, overcrowded boxcars and shipped to Stalag Luft I, a prisoner-of-war camp located near the town of Barth, on the bleak, windswept coast of the Baltic Sea. The camp was a sprawling grid of wooden barracks surrounded by double rows of barbed wire and high wooden guard towers. Winter in Stalag Luft I was a brutal test of endurance. The rations were virtually non-existent watery turnip soup and loaves of sawdust-filled bread that the prisoners called Kriegi bread. The temperature inside the barracks frequently dropped below freezing, and the men huddled together for warmth beneath thin, lice-infested blankets. Yet, in the grim monotony of the camp, the story of the piggyback flight spread like wildfire among the thousands of captured Allied airmen. Men would approach Rojan and Leek in the exercise yard, asking to hear the story of how they rode a dead bomber out of the sky, but Rojan rarely spoke of it. The memory of the crushing G-forces, the roaring fire on the lower wing, and the grim discovery of McNabb's crushed cockpit were not tales of glory to him. They were nightmares that woke him in a cold sweat in the dead of the Baltic winter. Leek handled it differently. He used the story to barter for extra rations or cigarettes, a survival mechanism to keep their spirits up. But late at night, when the camp was silent except for the sweeping beams of the searchlights, Leek would sit on the edge of his wooden bunk, staring at his hands, watching them tremble with the phantom vibration of a locked control yoke. The bond forged between the pilot and co-pilot during those agonizing 30 minutes in the air became unbreakable in the camp. They shared their meager Red Cross parcels, kept each other moving during bouts of dysentery, and held on to the singular, powerful truth that they had trusted each other implicitly when the laws of physics had demanded their deaths. Spring finally came to the Baltic coast in 1945, and with it, the distant, continuous rumble of Soviet artillery. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The German guards, terrified of being captured by the advancing Red Army, simply abandoned the camp in the middle of the night on April 30th. A few days later, Soviet troops rolled through the gates of Stalag Luft I. The war was officially over. The journey home was a blur of processing camps, medical checks, and finally, the glorious sight of the Statue of Liberty from the deck of a troop ship. But returning to civilian life was jarring. The world had moved on, and the young men who had fought in the skies over Europe were expected to simply pack away their uniforms and get jobs. Rojan returned to Pennsylvania, married, and started a career in the air conditioning and plumbing business. He was a quiet, humble man who rarely wore his medals. Leek returned to his life out west. They lived miles apart, separated by the vast expanse of the country they had fought for, but the invisible tether that had bound them together at 20,000 feet remained intact until the end of their days. Years later, the United States Army Air Forces officially recognized the unparalleled bravery of the piggyback flight. The records were declassified, and the incredible mathematics of the survival were analyzed by a new generation of engineers. For maintaining control of a doomed conjoined aircraft and saving the lives of their crewmen who successfully bailed out, both Captain Glenn Rojan and Lieutenant William Leek were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But for Rojan, the greatest medal was not pinned to his chest. It was the simple, undeniable fact that he had brought his co-pilot back alive. In the annals of aviation history, there are thousands of stories of bravery, of aces scoring impossible kills, and of crews fighting off swarms of fighters. But the story of the Bloody Hundredth's piggyback bombers remains entirely unique. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes survival does not depend on firepower or superior technology. Sometimes survival comes down to two exhausted, terrified men who simply refuse to let go of the yoke, who brace their boots against the pedals, and who fight against the very gravity of the earth until the bitter, final second. The rusted, twisted remains of the two B-17s were eventually cleared away by scrap drives in post-war Germany, melted down and repurposed for a world trying to rebuild. But the phantom shadow of that monstrous 8-engine beast still flies in the memories of those who know the history. A permanent ghost in the freezing skies over the North Sea, a monument to the unbreakable will of the men inside. The story of the piggyback flight defies everything we know about aviation, physics, and the limits of human endurance. Captain Glenn Rojan and Lieutenant William Leek were ordinary men thrust into an entirely extraordinary nightmare. They didn't just survive a mid-air collision, they conquered it, piloting a 120,000-pound tangled mass of doomed metal to the ground to ensure their crew lived. It is a profound reminder of the silent, unimaginable sacrifices made by the bomber boys of World War II, many of whom, like Lieutenant McNabb and Nelson Vaughn, never made it home. If this incredible true story of survival, duty, and sheer willpower kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to help honor the legacy of these brave airmen. Share this video with anyone who loves military history or tales of unbelievable courage, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the most astonishing true stories from the pages of history. What part of the flight shocked you the most? Let me know down in the comments below.